If a war were to break out between the US and China over the Taiwan Strait, who would stand to gain? Back in March 2021, that was when Admiral Philip Davidson, who was the commander of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command at the time, stood in front of the Senate Armed Services Committee and dropped a massive reality check. He warned everyone that China's military, the People's Liberation Army, was modernizing at an absolute breakneck pace. He said their ambitions were growing so fast that they could pose a serious threat to Taiwan within 6 years, specifically pointing to the year 2027. Ever since that testimony, military planners and DC insiders have called this timeline the Davidson window. But 2027 isn't the only date giving strategists nightmares. A lot of experts look just a little further down the road to 2030. According to the Pentagon's own projections, China is on track to deploy over 1,000 nuclear warheads by that year. Scholars from just about every major think tank out there have screamed from the rooftops that a US-China clash in 2030 could effortlessly and rapidly spiral out of control into a full-blown nuclear crisis. For instance, the Taipei School of Economics and Political Science Foundation, or TSEPS, actually organized their own massive civilian-led war games to simulate a defense of the Taiwan Strait, and they chose 2030 as their exact hypothetical D-Day. The Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, is pretty much the gold standard when it comes to running these massive, complex war games. They've run the Taiwan Strait scenario dozens of times, plugging in every variable imaginable. Let's look at the actual simulations. According to their results, if the US and Japan team up to jointly defend Taiwan, the PLA runs into a logistical brick wall. The simulations show that China heavily struggles to maintain long-term supply lines across the strait to support an amphibious landing. After about 3 weeks of absolute non-stop brutal combat, the PLA is ultimately repelled, but calling it a win for the West is a massive stretch. The wargame data shows that the PLA's naval and amphibious forces are completely devastated, but at the same time, Taiwan's economy and infrastructure face total, absolute collapse. And the US and Japan don't walk away clean either. They end up losing several of their prized aircraft carriers and dozens of advanced warships to the bottom of the Pacific. But it gets even darker. The simulation revealed that if the PLA found itself at a severe disadvantage on the battlefield, if their ships were sinking and they were backed into a corner, they wouldn't just pack up and go home. Instead, the data showed it was highly likely that Beijing would resort to using tactical nuclear weapons first, using them as a brutal shortcut to break the conventional stalemate. A war over Taiwan means mutual military exhaustion, the utter destruction of Taiwan's economy, the loss of America's naval dominance, and a massive, terrifyingly high probability of nuclear weapons being thrown around. When the two biggest kids on the global playground leave each other bleeding out in the dirt, the true winners aren't going to be Washington or Beijing. It's going to be the onlookers. It's going to be the secondary powers who watch the whole thing from the sidelines, completely untouched, ready to inherit a broken world. So if the two biggest heavyweights leave each other broken and battered, who actually walks away with the keys to the kingdom? First up, and arguably the biggest winner of all, is Russia. For years, Moscow has been pinned down, dealing with intense Western pressure, sanctions, and a grinding war on its western flank. But a US-China war over Taiwan? That is Vladimir Putin's ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card. The US simply cannot sustain a high-intensity, peer-to-peer hot war in the Pacific, while simultaneously pouring hundreds of billions of dollars, intelligence assets, and weapons into Eastern Europe. Something has to give. To avoid a two-front nightmare, Washington would be forced to quietly throw its hands up and play nice with Moscow just to keep them neutral. And that means Ukraine becomes the tragic sacrifice. To get Russia to look the other way, the US and Europe would likely have to swallow an incredibly bitter pill, officially recognizing Russia's territorial gains and letting Ukraine be permanently split in two. On top of that, look at the economic flip. A Western blockade would completely cut China off from global maritime trade. Where does a desperate Beijing turn for oil, gas, And raw minerals? Russia. But the power dynamic completely reverses. China would no longer be the dominant partner calling the shots. Instead, an insulated Russia becomes China's absolute infrastructure lifeline, dictating the terms, setting the prices, and gaining unprecedented economic leverage over Beijing for a generation. Right behind Russia is India. And for New Delhi, a Taiwan conflict is a geopolitical jackpot. India has spent decades playing a careful balancing act, refusing to become a vassal state to Washington while watching China's growing influence with deep suspicion. The moment the first missile flies across the Taiwan Strait, India gets to step onto the world stage and loudly declare itself the undisputed leader of the global South. They become the third pole, the safe, stable, democratic giant that isn't dropping bombs or getting blockaded. As Western corporations desperately scramble to pull their factories out of a chaotic East Asia, India will be standing there with open arms, absorbing decades of industrial growth and foreign investment in a matter of months. But it gets even better for them regionally. Historically, Beijing has used neighboring countries like Nepal, Myanmar, and Bangladesh to financially hem India in and keep them distracted. But with China's economy fracturing and its military entirely focused on surviving the Pacific, those anti-India factions lose their bankroll overnight. Their influence completely evaporates, leaving India to finally secure absolute, undisputed hegemony over South Asia. Next on the list is Japan. Now, unlike Russia or India, Japan won't get to watch this from the sidelines. Because of geography and its deep alliance with Washington, Japan is almost guaranteed to get dragged directly into the teeth of the conflict. Japanese bases will be targeted and their forces will be fighting for survival. But out of that absolute chaos comes a historic, long-awaited political prize: the normalization of Japan. Ever since the end of World War II, Tokyo has lived under a pacifist constitution that heavily restricts its military, forcing it to rely on the U.S. defense umbrella. But when that umbrella is actively being shredded by Chinese missiles, the old rules go completely out the window. A Taiwan war gives Japanese leaders the perfect, unassailable justification to permanently tear up those post-war restrictions. Japan will rapidly build out an aggressive, unchained, state-of-the-art military posture. Even better for their domestic front, the insatiable demand for weapons, logistics, and high-tech repairs to support the Allied war effort will trigger a massive domestic manufacturing boom, snapping the Japanese economy out of its long-standing stagnation. By the time the war ends, a rearmed, fiercely independent Japan will step up as the primary security boss for Southeast Asia, fundamentally altering the balance of power in the Pacific. Behind the big three, you have a whole tier of independent middle powers, countries like Turkey, Brazil, Indonesia, and South Korea, whose international leverage is going to skyrocket. With the old US-China bipolar order completely shattered, these nations won't have to pick a side anymore. Instead, they get to play the ultimate game of strategic arbitrage. They can sit back, refuse to join sanctions, and extract massive trade deals, technology transfers, and political favors from both desperate camps. Their voices in global governance will instantly become much louder because suddenly everyone needs their favor. But the benefits aren't just measured in flags and borders, they're measured in factories. Let's talk about the economic jackpot. The moment the conflict starts, Taiwan's semiconductor foundries, specifically TSMC, which practically runs the modern tech world, will either be completely destroyed or totally blockaded. Combine that with a hard, violent decoupling from Chinese manufacturing, and the global economy faces an existential crisis. Supply chains can't just stop. They have to move, and they have to move now. This triggers an immediate, forced exodus of global manufacturing. Countries that already have decent industrial bases and low labor costs are going to see decades of economic development compressed into a few hypercharged years. We are talking about a massive, permanent shift of wealth and industrial capacity to places like Vietnam, India, Mexico, and Poland. These nations will essentially inherit the manufacturing mantle that China spent 40 years building. Finally, there is one last group that will walk away from a Taiwan war counting mountains of cash: the global defense industrial complex. The sheer scale of destruction in a modern peer-to-peer superpower conflict is almost impossible to wrap your head around. In just a few weeks of combat, thousands of advanced drones, hypersonic missiles, naval destroyers, and cyber warfare tools will be completely wiped out. The global stockpiles of the Western world and Asia will be bone dry. What follows will be a mandatory, global rearmament cycle on a scale the world hasn't witnessed since World War II. Defense contractors, not just in the US and Europe, but in non-aligned and middle-power nations too, will experience a multi-decade economic boom. Governments everywhere, suddenly terrified by the reality of total war, will pour trillions of dollars into rebuilding their militaries from scratch. It looks like a massive, violent restructuring of the global order where the primary combatants bleed themselves dry, while the onlookers, the alternative factories, and the arms dealers inherit the earth. If you think a Taiwan conflict stays confined to Asia, you are missing the massive ripple effect. Because while the global cops are busy fighting each other, the local heavyweights are going to settle some very old scores. Geographically, Israel has always been stuck in a terrifying trap. They are a tiny country completely surrounded by hostile proxy forces: Hamas, Hezbollah, and the big boss pulling all the strings, Iran. Normally, under everyday geopolitical conditions, Israel is kept on a pretty tight leash. The fear of crashing the global oil market and intense diplomatic pressure from Washington usually keeps them from going completely scorched earth. They generally have to stick to targeted airstrikes and covert ops. But imagine the U.S. is suddenly fighting for its absolute life in the South China Sea. All of Washington's attention, its aircraft carriers, and its diplomatic energy are entirely sucked into the Pacific. For Israel, that massive American distraction is the ultimate, once-in-a-century green light. With nobody holding them back, Israeli leadership is going to seize the moment. We aren't talking about limited border skirmishes anymore. We are talking about a massive, unrestrained, preemptive military campaign. They will go all out to permanently dismantle the missile threats in Lebanon, aggressively clear out hostile factions in Palestine, and launch deep, devastating strikes straight into the heart of Iran's nuclear and military infrastructure. And in the beginning, it's going to look incredibly successful. Israel has an overwhelming edge when it comes to raw technology, air superiority, and sheer intelligence capability. They will hit fast, hard, and accurately, crippling their enemies' command structures in the opening weeks. But here is where the trap brutally snaps shut. Because Iran isn't just going to sit there and take it. Iran has its own massive geopolitical ambitions. While Israel sees America's distraction as a chance to secure its borders, Tehran sees that exact same distraction as its ultimate chance to expel Western influence once and for all and establish absolute regional hegemony. And Tehran won't be fighting alone. This is where China plays a massive, terrifying wild card. They need a second front to bleed the West dry, and Iran is the absolute perfect candidate. China will stop playing coy. They will start openly pouring top-tier military assets directly into Iran. We're talking advanced heavy weapons, cutting-edge electronic warfare jammers, and real-time military satellite intelligence feeding directly to Iranian forces and their proxy networks. Suddenly, Israel isn't just fighting a collection of isolated militias. They are fighting a hyper-coordinated, highly funded, Chinese-backed military machine. Israel has the technological edge, but the surrounding hostile populations absolutely dwarf them in sheer numbers. When you combine endless manpower with unlimited Chinese tech and zero American intervention to keep the peace, the initial Israeli blitzkrieg inevitably stalls out. What starts as a fast, high-tech, preemptive strike quickly sinks into a dark, grinding, multi-year proxy war. If you look back at the last 30 or 40 years of global history, a bizarre pattern emerges. Why is it that the U.S. military can march into almost any theater, deploy the most high-tech weaponry on Earth, and successfully win practically every single tactical battle, yet the country somehow walks away, losing the strategic war? We saw it in Vietnam, we saw it in Iraq, we saw it in Afghanistan. On paper, the kinetic superiority of the U.S. armed forces is completely unmatched. If the goal is to blow up a specific target, sink a specific ship, or seize a specific piece of terrain, the Pentagon gets it done. But the fatal flaw in modern Western strategic thinking is defining victory by military metrics: ships sunk, missiles intercepted, territory held. But America's rivals, especially Beijing, define victory by political and systemic endurance. They aren't playing a short-term game of capture the flag. They are playing a long-term game of structural survival. If a hot war kicks off in the Pacific, the U.S. and Japan might technically win the battle for Taiwan by successfully repelling a Chinese amphibious landing after 3 weeks of absolute carnage. But the U.S. walks away with its naval dominance shattered, its most expensive aircraft carriers sitting at the bottom of the ocean, and its domestic economy reeling from the collapse of global tech supply chains. Taiwan is left completely devastated, its infrastructure reduced to rubble, and its crown jewel semiconductor industry wiped off the map. Meanwhile, the global financial system is fractured beyond repair, forcing a massive chunk of the world to abandon the U.S. dollar system entirely. The tragic irony of a U.S.-China war over Taiwan is that both superpowers would bleed themselves absolutely white. They would bankrupt their economies, exhaust their militaries, and burn through their global credibility, only to look up from the rubble and realize they just handed the keys of the 21st century to the people who stayed out of the meat grinder. They will have sacrificed everything just to make Russia structurally independent, turn India into the undisputed economic powerhouse of the global South, unchain Japan's military shackles, and trigger a multi-decade gold rush for arms dealers and alternative manufacturing hubs. In the high-stakes game of global empires, sometimes the ultimate tactical victory is a strategic suicide. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next breakdown. I'll see you in the next video.